Hi everybody, and welcome to this evening's study. So we will continue the study in Exodus, from Exodus 4:18 to verses 10 and 29. We will tip over a little bit into chapter 11, just so I can finish off the 10th plague. So we continue the story as Moses returned to Egypt after receiving his calling and commissioning from the Lord. And it's important to remember that Pharaoh and Egypt lived in a polytheistic society and had built their wealth and power on the back of persecution and slavery. And Moses was about to confront the tyrannical leader of the nation that was holding God's people. The clash of the two kingdoms was about to commence, and it was now time for action. So we start our study at chapter 4, verse 21 to 23. The Lord is speaking to Moses, and he gives him a kind of a quick synopsis of the narrative that is to come, starting with the wonders and the plagues before Pharaoh, and ending with the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son. And in that passage, the Lord makes this statement: Israel is my firstborn son. Now, throughout this video, I'm going to ask you to stop, and I'm going to give you a question. And this is one of those moments, and so you can then go and discuss it amongst yourselves. So this question is, what is the importance of the firstborn son? So stop the video and have a quick discussion amongst yourselves. Then in verse 24 and 26, we see a very strange event. Moses meets with the Lord at a lodging place, and the Lord is about to kill him. Now, there is a lot of discussion around this passage, and it's actually quite difficult to understand. But for me, Moses had not circumcised his son, so he was not keeping with the covenantal requirements as a child of Israel, which was laid out to the Lord to Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 10 to 14. And in the last video, God states, I have remembered my covenant with Israel. Moses could not represent God against Egypt unless he was obedient to the Lord and to the covenantal requirements laid down by the Lord. Zipporah, his wife, then conducts the procedure so that Moses was obedient to the Lord. In verse 27, we see God's first promise come to fruition when Moses meets up with Aaron and explains the plan ahead. Then we skip to verse 29 to 31. Moses and Aaron meet the elders of the Israelites. The Israelites had been in slavery for around 300 to 400 years, which again is a highly debated topic. And their faith in God had been affected. Moses did as God had commanded and performed the signs and the wonders, and they bowed and worshipped the Lord. Then we come to chapter 5. Moses and Aaron deliver God's message to Pharaoh. He said, the Lord said, let my people go. Pharaoh's response tells us a lot about him. In verse 2, he replies, who is this Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? Pharaoh hailed himself as a god and was worshipped as such by the Egyptians. And he put himself in a direct opposition to the God of Israel. The story in the rest of chapter 5 covers how Pharaoh increases the requirements on the enslaved Israelites. Basically, because of God's ultimatum, Pharaoh decides to be even more cruel, even more horrible to the captive Israelites. And as we know, he basically expected them to carry on with the same amount of bricks, but had to find their own straw. The tyrannical slave driver increases his persecution of God's people. The battle for freedom has commenced. So here's the next question. Why is it that when we stand up for God against evil, sometimes things get worse before they get better? So stop the video and have a quick chat amongst yourselves about that. In verse 22, Moses complains to God again. Why have you brought trouble on this people? Moses seems to still be struggling with his faith and belief in God's power and ability to complete the task at hand. I was trying to think of a modern day equivalent of Moses' situation, and I was thinking it's like God sending one of us to maybe Iran and stand in front of all the religious leaders and the leaders of the country and saying to them, denounce all of their beliefs in Islam and follow the Christian God, follow Jesus. Yeah, when you put it in that kind of context, kind of maybe we can understand a little bit why Moses acts the way he does. In chapter 6, it starts with God again reassuring Moses and then instructs him to tell the Israelites. And in verse 6 and 8, I'm going to read this entire passage. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Brilliant. But again, as we read on, the Israelites did not listen to the Lord's message because of the increased persecution, because of the increased torture and the harder work that they had to do. I wonder, how would we feel in the same circumstances? And we start to see the two-fronted theme of this part of Scripture. On one hand, we have the battle for freedom from persecution from Pharaoh. And on the other hand, we have the reigniting of the faith and the trust of the Israelites back to the Lord. The next several verses cover the family record of Moses and Aaron. And in verse 25, we see that they are from the family of Levites. And as we know, the Levites go on to be the priests to serve in the temple. And they are a direct descendant from the line of Aaron. In chapter 7, things start to get interesting. In verse 8, we read the first sign and the wonder is carried out in front of Pharaoh when Aaron throws down the staff and it turns into a snake. But Pharaoh summons his own magicians and sorcerers, and they throw their staffs down, and they too change to snakes. But Aaron's staff swallows the others. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It's interesting, the symbology of the staff. The staff was a representation of the finger of God. And as such, the power of God that cannot be defeated, as we are about to see. Then we come to the 10 plagues. From chapter 7, verse 4 up to chapter 11. Some scholars believe that each plague was a direct judgment against the mythical Egyptian gods, showing God's sovereignty, true power over these idol gods and his creation. Also showing the Egyptian people the one true God, the God of Israel. So let's just go through each plague and tie it to the Egyptian God as we go through. So the plague of blood was a judgment against Hapi, who was the god of water. The plague of frogs was against Heket. It had a frog's head. The plague of gnats was against Geb, the god of the dust and the earth. And as we see in the scripture, it says that the Lord will smite the dust, and out of that came the gnats. The plague of flies against Kepri, who had a head of a fly. Against the plague of livestock against Hathor, who had a head of a cow. The plague of boils and sores was against Isis, the goddess of medicine. The plague of hail and fire against Nut, the goddess of the sky. The plague of locusts against Seth, god of the storms and disorder. The plague of darkness against Ra, god of the sun. And finally, the plague of the firstborn against Pharaoh himself, who put himself as a god over all of the other Egyptian gods. There are also beautiful parallels to the style, composition of the plague account that mirrors the creation story, which, if you're interested, would require further study. To give an example, in the creation story, there are 10 instances or utterances where God says and speaks. And in this instance, the finger of God acts 10 times. But of course, in the creation story, God speaks and creates his kingdom. In this instance, in the plague instance, God acts 10 times and deconstructs the kingdom of Egypt, bit by bit, not only physically by stripping its worldly power, but also spiritually to reveal the truth that there is only one God and life only comes from the Lord. Interestingly, after the third plague, we see God separate the Israelites from the rest of Egypt. And from the fourth plague onwards, the Israelites won't be affected. So this is the final question. So why did God let the Israelites experience the first 3 plagues, but then he saved them from the rest? So just pause the video and discuss that amongst yourselves. So as we kind of bring this into a bit of a close, did this change Pharaoh's heart? No. After all those plagues, as we read, after every plague, Pharaoh either hardened his heart or lies to Moses to get a release from the current plague, but never really agrees to let the captive Israelites go. God has shown to the Israelites he is their Lord. He is sovereign over creation. He is the one and only God. For those who follow, trust, and put their faith in the Lord, there is deliverance from the oppression of sin. The battle was already won, as it is for us today. The 2 kingdoms have come together, and there is only going to be one outcome. But there is still one last battle to win. I hope that's helpful, and I trust you will enjoy discussing these scriptures further in your group study.